Title: The Unified Trilemma Framework. Diagnosing How Financial Engineering Distorts Nation-State Economics. Executive Summary. Traditional macroeconomic models treat sovereign policy choices as isolated knobs, assuming that flexible exchange rates provide complete insulation from external shocks. This view fails to explain how modern financial engineering, offshore credit markets, yield curve control, and central bank swap networks can mask structural deficits for decades. The Unified Trilemma Framework resolves this blind spot by establishing an optical taxonomy for open economy macroeconomics. Financial engineering cannot eliminate systemic constraints. It can only alter the transmission, timing, and geographic location of their costs. By organizing these constraints into a 5-layer optical stack, the Unified Trilemma Framework provides a precise diagnostic model to track how sovereign states manipulate market telemetry, how reserve asset trust decays under balance sheet overexposure, and why paper claims must ultimately be re-anchored to a machine-native physical production floor. Section 1. Introduction and Primary Thesis. Standard Mundell-Fleming trilemma analysis asserts that a nation-state can select only 2 of 3 policy options: a fixed exchange rate, independent monetary policy, and free capital mobility. Modern reserve issuers appear to bypass this constraint, enjoying decades of low domestic consumer inflation alongside massive fiscal deficits and unrestrained capital flows. This apparent exemption is an optical illusion. Sovereign states do not eliminate the constraints of the trilemma. They redistribute, delay, and relocate where the costs appear. Through offshore balance sheet mechanisms, financial repression, and central bank liquidity facilities, hegemonic powers shift monetary noise away from domestic consumer price sensors and onto foreign balance sheets, future generations, or hidden asset price inflation. The Optical Stack. The accompanying image presents a 5-layer diagnostic architecture for sovereign macroeconomics. At the top sits Layer 1, Policy Architecture, representing the Mundell-Fleming trilemma and the formal policy choices available to sovereign states. The second layer illustrates international transmission, showing how offshore credit markets and surplus recycling mechanisms alter the flow of monetary expansion throughout the global economy. The third layer represents sovereign balance sheet sensors, measuring financing capacity, monetary sensitivity, and capital repricing velocity across the system. The fourth layer depicts operational trust decay, represented by the reserve asset trust test, where reserve asset viability is evaluated across multiple variables, including liquidity, accessibility, real returns, and political neutrality. Finally, the fifth layer illustrates the physical production baseline, grounding monetary claims in real output capacity and synthetic labor and automated manpower. Together, the image depicts a top-down diagnostic workflow showing how sovereign policy decisions propagate through increasingly fundamental layers of economic reality. The primary invariant of the framework is straightforward. Open quote, "You cannot fix an economic productivity deficit with financial engineering." Close quote. When an empire's accumulated financial claims outstrip its physical capacity to generate wealth, financial engineering can stretch time horizons, but it ultimately causes signal degradation in market telemetry. Resolving this crisis requires moving beyond monetary manipulation to anchor the balance sheet to an expanding physical production baseline. Section 2. The Foundational Taxonomy. To diagnose structural noise within a sovereign economy, the Unified Trilemma Framework translates abstract policy levers into 3 observable balance sheet sensors. Sovereign financing capacity, the aperture. The aperture measures the state's capacity to absorb fiscal deficits without triggering an immediate sovereign debt crisis. When a central bank expands its aperture via quantitative easing or yield curve control, it monetizes debt and artificially suppresses yields to protect state solvency. Its diagnostic function is straightforward. Widening the aperture keeps the state funded, but it floods the system with light, or base money, increasing total exposure and risking severe signal degradation across the rest of the balance sheet. Monetary sensitivity. The ISO monetary sensitivity reflects how rapidly domestic prices and currency values react to monetary expansion. Under a hard monetary anchor, such as a gold standard or strict currency board, ISO is fixed at a low setting. The system cannot absorb excess credit without immediate visible feedback. Its diagnostic function is equally important. Unanchored fiat regimes attempt to lower systemic ISO by suppressing wage growth, importing cheap consumer goods, or directing excess liquidity into asset markets rather than consumer price indexes. This hides inflationary noise on primary sensors while building destructive pressure in secondary channels. Capital repricing velocity, the shutter speed. Shutter speed represents the rate at which international and domestic capital reprices risk, reduces duration, or flees the jurisdiction under conditions of free capital mobility. A high shutter speed allows market participants to instantly punish irresponsible fiscal or monetary policy through capital flight, currency depreciation, and surging bond yields. To prevent this, sovereigns deploy financial repression, forcing domestic banks to hold low-yielding sovereign debt, or imposing capital controls, effectively freezing the shutter speed to prevent the market from capturing the true extent of exposure. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 3. The multi-layered optical stack. Rather than compressing complex international dynamics into a single static model, the Unified Trilemma Framework organizes macroeconomic transmission into a 5-layer stack. Each layer performs a distinct function and possesses its own structural failure point. Layer 1 is policy architecture. It establishes formal exchange rate, capital flow, and interest rate parameters. Its primary failure point emerges when policy trilemma trade-offs are forced by capital flight or currency collapse. Layer 2 is international transmission. It redistributes dollar credit and recycles trade surpluses globally through mechanisms such as eurodollars and petrodollars. Its structural failure points include balance sheet fragmentation, offshore dollar shortages, and regional de-dollarization. Layer 3 consists of sovereign sensors. These track the real-time interaction between financing capacity, monetary sensitivity, and repricing speed. Failure at this layer manifests as explosive interest expenses, structural inflation, or severe financial repression. Layer 4 represents operational trust decay. This layer evaluates the multivariable viability of holding sovereign liabilities as reserve assets. Its failure point occurs when counterparty risk overrides network utility, causing structural reserve diversification. Layer 5 is the production baseline. This layer grounds monetary claims in actual physical energy, manufacturing, and labor capacity. Its failure point is reached when accumulated paper claims exceed real productive output, creating an economic productivity deficit. Section 4. Deep dive layers 2, 4, and 5. Layer 2. Offshore credit expansion and surplus recycling. The post-Bretton Woods system relies on complex offshore transmission belts that alter how monetary expansion flows throughout the global economy. The first component is the Eurodollar network. This is a distributed, offshore banking ecosystem that generates dollar-denominated credit outside direct Federal Reserve regulation. Rather than United States-based money being exported abroad, offshore commercial banks expand their own dollar liabilities. This vastly increases global liquidity, absorbing liquidity pressures that might otherwise drive immediate United States consumer price inflation, while simultaneously creating deep, unbacked offshore leverage. The second component is surplus recycling, represented by the petrodollar and sovereign wealth loops. Geopolitical agreements and global energy settlement conventions historically incentivized oil exporters and industrial nations to recycle trade surpluses directly into United States Treasury securities. This mechanism generated a mandatory artificial bid for sovereign debt, allowing the reserve issuer to run persistent twin deficits without experiencing typical currency depreciation or yield spikes. Layer 4. The Reserve Asset Trust Test. Reserve status is not a permanent privilege, nor does it end in a single binary collapse. It degrades through an operational sequence known as the Reserve Asset Trust Test. When a reserve issuer weaponizes payment networks, such as freezing central bank reserves, or allows domestic debasement to accelerate, foreign counterparties evaluate reserve assets across 10 variables. The Reserve Asset Trust Test. The accompanying image presents a 10-variable diagnostic framework used to evaluate the viability of sovereign liabilities as reserve assets. The first category evaluates liquidity, the second evaluates accessibility, the third examines enforceability, the fourth considers political neutrality, the fifth measures convertibility, the sixth evaluates settlement access, the seventh examines real returns, the eighth measures custodial security, the ninth evaluates concentration risk, and finally, the 10th measures exit cost. Together, these variables provide a multidimensional assessment of reserve asset trust rather than reducing reserve status to a simple binary outcome of success or failure. The image also depicts the operational decay sequence of reserve assets as trust deteriorates over time. It begins with marginal distrust. This is followed by duration reduction, then custodial diversification, followed by alternative settlement mechanisms, and finally, structural fragmentation. The framework illustrates that reserve asset degradation is not a singular event, but rather a progressive process driven by the interaction of political, legal, monetary, and custodial risks. When the political, legal, and debasement risks of holding sovereign liabilities exceed the network and liquidity benefits, reserve holders move through a clear decay sequence. Marginal distrust becomes duration reduction. Duration reduction becomes custodial diversification. Custodial diversification becomes alternative settlement, and alternative settlement eventually becomes structural fragmentation. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 4. Deep Dive Layers 2, 4, and 5. Layer 5. The Physical Production Baseline, Synthetic Labor and Automated Manpower. When a sovereign nation uses financial engineering to cover structural deficits, it accumulates paper claims, debt, entitlements, and unfunded liabilities faster than its real economy grows. This creates a severe economic productivity deficit. The productive matching principle. The accompanying image presents the productive matching principle, the foundational relationship between accumulated financial claims and real productive capacity. The image is divided into two sides. On the left are accumulated financial claims. These include debt, money supply expansion, and financial leverage. On the right is the physical real production baseline. This consists of energy production, goods, agriculture, and services. The central proposition of the framework is that accumulated financial claims cannot permanently outpace the physical productive capacity of the underlying economy. The diagnostic conclusion is straightforward. Financial engineering cannot manufacture physical capacity. The proposed remedy is equally straightforward. Expand the physical productive floor through automation and productive capacity expansion. The productive matching principle therefore serves as the final anchor of the Unified Trilemma Framework, grounding paper claims in physical economic reality. Monetary credibility cannot be permanently sustained by balance sheet optics alone. The value of any currency ultimately rests on what it can buy in the real economy. Under conditions of rapid demographic aging, shrinking labor forces, and ballooning sovereign debt, traditional fiscal policy fails. Synthetic labor and automated manpower introduces a framework for real-side realignment. Synthetic labor refers to autonomous digital systems handling high-complexity cognitive, administrative, and analytical tasks. Automated manpower refers to robotics and physical automation deployed across agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, and energy production. Synthetic labor and automated manpower is not a monetary printing rule or a valuation formula. It is a physical capacity floor. By driving unit production costs towards zero and expanding real physical output independent of human demographic constraints, synthetic labor and automated manpower builds the real economic output needed to service, absorb, or retire accumulated paper claims without triggering hyperinflationary collapse. Section 5. Historical case studies. The Japanese paradigm, closed-loop speed suppression. Japan represents a case study in domestic financial repression used to manage severe demographic decline and sovereign debt exceeding 250% of gross domestic product. The Japanese paradigm. The accompanying image illustrates a closed-loop sovereign financing architecture. At the top of the framework sits the Ministry of Finance, which issues massive quantities of Japanese government bonds. These bonds flow directly to the Bank of Japan, which purchases them through yield curve control policies. In doing so, The Bank of Japan widens the aperture while simultaneously suppressing sovereign borrowing costs. The monetary transmission mechanism then extends to domestic institutions, including the Japanese postal savings system and pension funds. Because these institutions are overwhelmingly domestic and relatively captive sources of capital, exit mobility is substantially reduced. The image therefore depicts a system operating as a self-contained monetary loop. Sovereign debt issuance becomes central bank purchases. Central bank purchases become suppressed yields. Suppressed yields become captive domestic capital. And captive domestic capital effectively freezes capital repricing velocity within the system. The result is a monetary architecture capable of delaying market repricing for extended periods of time, albeit at considerable long-term cost. The mechanism is straightforward. The Bank of Japan widened its aperture through yield curve control, capping 10-year yields while purchasing massive quantities of government debt. The transmission mechanism is equally important. Because Japanese debt is held predominantly by captive domestic institutions and household savings, the system effectively froze its shutter speed. Capital did not flee en masse, and domestic consumer inflation remained low for decades. The costs, however, were not eliminated. They were relocated to domestic savers, who endured negative real returns for decades, to dynamic economic growth through stagnant productivity, and ultimately to an extreme devaluation of the yen once global interest rates diverged. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 5, Historical Case Studies, continued. The American Hegemony, the Offshore Transmission Belt. The United States leveraged global reserve status to run persistent fiscal and trade deficits for over half a century, defying conventional open economy constraints. The accompanying image illustrates the offshore transmission architecture that underpins modern dollar hegemony. The framework begins with United States fiscal deficits. Through persistent fiscal and current account deficits, the United States exports dollar-denominated claims throughout the global economy. These liabilities are transmitted into the Eurodollar system, where offshore commercial banks expand dollar credit outside the direct regulatory jurisdiction of the Federal Reserve. This offshore credit creation absorbs local price shocks and dramatically expands global dollar liquidity. The process then extends into the petrodollar loop, whereby foreign nations accumulate dollar reserves and recycle trade surpluses into United States Treasury securities. The result is a self-reinforcing transmission mechanism. United States fiscal deficits become exported dollar claims. Exported dollar claims become offshore credit expansion. Offshore credit expansion becomes reserve accumulation abroad. Reserve accumulation becomes structural demand for United States Treasury securities. And structural demand suppresses domestic borrowing costs while simultaneously expanding the reserve issuer's fiscal capacity. The image therefore depicts an international monetary transmission belt that redistributes the costs of monetary expansion across jurisdictions, balance sheets, and time horizons. The mechanism is straightforward. The United States exported dollar liabilities worldwide via current account deficits, supported by the petrodollar recycling loop and deep, liquid treasury markets. The transmission mechanism is equally important. Massive offshore dollar demand, represented by Layer 2 of the Optical Stack, absorbed dollar expansion while dampening immediate domestic consumer price signals, effectively lowering ISO. The Triffin dilemma subsequently took effect. Reserve demand artificially strengthened the dollar, gutting domestic industrial manufacturing, commonly referred to as the Rust Belt, while simultaneously expanding the financial sector. The crisis point emerged when the United States weaponized SWIFT payment channels and froze foreign central bank assets in 2022. In doing so, it altered the variables of the reserve asset trust test, represented by Layer 4 of the Optical Stack. Foreign official institutions subsequently began shifting from long-duration Treasury securities toward physical gold, non-aligned commodities, and bilateral trade clearing arrangements, forcing monetary noise back onto the domestic balance sheet. Central bank swap lines, the crisis backstop. The evolution of Federal Reserve swap lines illustrates the fundamental tension between offshore credit creation and crisis resolution. The first stage is private offshore creation. Eurodollar banks create dollar-denominated loans and liabilities decentralized across global balance sheets during periods of economic expansion. The second stage is public crisis centralization. During systemic panics, private offshore wholesale markets freeze. Foreign commercial banks face acute dollar shortages, threatening a cascading liquidation of dollar assets throughout the global financial system. The final stage is resolution. The Federal Reserve deploys central bank liquidity swap lines, supplying dollars directly to foreign official nodes, including the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, and the Swiss National Bank. This confirms a core principle of the Unified Trilemma Framework. The international dollar system is decentralized in credit creation during periods of expansion, but strictly centralized in crisis resolution. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 6. Diagnostic Summary and Conclusion. The Unified Trilemma Framework shifts macroeconomic analysis from passive observation to a structured diagnostic discipline. The Systemic Diagnostic Workflow. The accompanying image presents a 5-step diagnostic workflow for evaluating sovereign monetary systems. The first question asks us to identify the aperture, or sovereign financing capacity. Is the central bank directly monetizing sovereign debt or enforcing yield curve control policies? The objective is to determine whether the state's financing capacity is being artificially expanded through monetary intervention. The second question asks us to measure monetary sensitivity, or ISO. Where is excess liquidity appearing within the system? Is it manifesting in consumer prices, equity markets, housing markets, or offshore financial channels? The purpose is to identify where monetary noise is accumulating and whether it is being displaced away from traditional inflation measures. The third question evaluates shutter speed, or capital repricing velocity. Are capital controls or financial repression mechanisms masking the true market price of sovereign risk? This diagnostic layer measures the speed at which domestic and international capital can reprice fiscal and monetary deterioration. The fourth question scores the reserve asset trust test. Are counterparties reducing asset duration, diversifying custodial arrangements, or seeking native reserve assets? This stage evaluates whether reserve asset trust is deteriorating across political, monetary, and custodial dimensions. The fifth and final question audits the production baseline. Do real physical output and automation capacity match the accumulated financial claims of the sovereign balance sheet? This final diagnostic step grounds all preceding layers in productive reality. The image therefore depicts a sequential diagnostic process that moves from monetary architecture toward physical economic capacity. It begins with policy choices and concludes by asking whether real output can ultimately sustain the accumulated claims of the state. Final conclusion. Financial engineering, whether deployed through central bank asset purchases, offshore credit expansion, or official swap facilities, is an optical modifier. It alters where, when, and how economic stress appears, but it cannot dissolve the physical laws of scarcity and productivity. When sovereign claims accumulate past the point of physical serviceability, balance sheet optics inevitably degrade, leading to capital flight, currency devaluation, and reserve asset diversification. Long-term economic stability cannot be printed, engineered, or papered over. It requires grounding the sovereign balance sheet in a high-density physical production baseline, leveraging synthetic labor and automated manpower to ensure that real output matches the claims of the state. Before we conclude, it is worth restating the primary invariant of the Unified Trilemma Framework. Financial engineering cannot eliminate systemic constraints. It can only alter the transmission, timing, and geographic location of their costs. And beneath that proposition lies an even more fundamental observation. You cannot fix an economic productivity deficit with financial engineering. The Unified Trilemma Framework therefore presents a diagnostic approach to sovereign macroeconomics. It proposes that monetary systems do not abolish constraints. They merely redistribute them across time, jurisdictions, balance sheets, and productive systems. Ultimately, all accumulated claims must settle against productive reality.